After being at MUN, I did a postdoc in Saskatoon, and I lived there for 3 years. And since 2014, I've been here in the UK. There we go. Right. So you guys should see the full screen presentation there. Yeah, so I'm at the Natural History Museum, which is based in London, and part of the Adrift Lab, which is a 3-institution partnership with the University of Tasmania and the Lord Howe Island Museum. I also help run an organization called LGBTQ STEM. We've just celebrated our 6th anniversary, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the presentation. We already had land acknowledgement, and I'd like to just reemphasize that and particularly recognize any of our Two-Spirit siblings here today. As a queer kid, I had secrets. I mean, every kid has secrets. This is my I'm ready for my close-up Mr. DeMille picture. Some of you might recognize this as being the mini golf course in St. John, New Brunswick. This is probably about 1988 or something like that. And at the time, you know, I was about 9, 10. That's when you sort of first start to wrestle with who you are as a person. And then, you know, so growing up as a teenager in New Brunswick, it took me quite a while to realize that I was gay and queer. And part of the thing that sort of influenced me at that time was a particular show on Showtime, which aired Friday nights at 11 o'clock, which was incredibly rebellious, called Queer as Folk, which followed the exploits of a group of friends in Pittsburgh, although it was actually filmed in Toronto. And that was sort of the first representation, the first positive representation of queer folks in popular culture. And so what I'm going to talk about today is my own journey. So from this incredibly cool kid, growing up in the Maritimes, to where I am now. So I'm curator at the Natural History Museum. I've traveled all over the world doing some really neat research and had the chance to work with some really amazing people. So when I give this talk in person in the UK, I say, does anyone know who this is? And of course, nobody does. Some of you might recognize this as Elsie Wayne. She was the mayor of St. John, New Brunswick in the late 80s, early 90s, and then a member of parliament for the Conservatives from 1993 up until, I think, about 2001 or so. She was a family friend of my grandparents. She came to my aunt's wedding and I danced with her. This is about 30 years ago. And she was also staunchly homophobic. She was one of the most vocal opponents of same-sex marriage in Canada in the lead up to its legalization between 2003 and 2005. And this is sort of the culture and the sort of discourse that was happening at the time. And I mean, now, you know, we've got Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and social media, and that's how that discussion starts to take place. In the late 90s and early 2000s, we obviously didn't have that. We had newspaper op-ed and letter to the editor section. So a few weeks ago, I went back and looked at the Telegraph Journal, which was the provincial newspaper for New Brunswick. And in particular, I found the issue from the 21st of June, 2003. So at this point, same-sex marriage had been legalized in Ontario, but was still 2 years away from happening in New Brunswick. And it was sort of a vox pop interview with people saying, why do you oppose gay marriage? Apparently, it violates and discriminates against the straight community, which is absolutely brilliant. Didn't realize that was part of your cultural and time-honored heritage. Denies every child in Canada the right to a father-mother parenthood. Fine. The sight of two men kissing and talking about sex is repulsive to me, and I can't help it. It's the way God made me, because that's all we do is we kiss our partners and we have sex, and that's all that we do. Of course not. But this gives you an idea of sort of the atmosphere and the public mood at the time. And for me, there are a couple really defining moments. So first off, this is Dylan Vreend. He was a chemistry lab instructor in Edmonton and was fired because he was gay. This is in the early 90s. And he fought that all the way up to the Supreme Court, and that's when workplace protections were read into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it was the case of Vreend versus Alberta that essentially gave us employment protection for queer folks in Canada. In 1998, a college student in Laramie, Wyoming called Matthew Shepard was beaten to death after being tied to a fence and died several days later. And this was the first example of violence against queer people that really captured the national and international media attention and led to some of the first hate crime legislation in the US. It was later turned into a play by Moises Kaufman and the Tectonic Theatre Project called the Laramie Project. And then, of course, in 2005, Canada became the third country in the world to approve what they call gay marriage, same-sex marriage. And so that's sort of where we were, and where are we today? I'm sharing with you, this is a snippet from an email that a colleague sent me. My colleague organized their institutional seminar series, much like we have here, and noticed that over the previous sort of 5 years or so, something like 80% of the speakers were white men. And being in the UK, she put out the call saying, right, we want some more diverse speakers. And this was the response back from one member of the department. And isn't it the individual and not the group, the only ethical and moral consideration to be had? Essentially, the list of speakers surely, if they're all, straight white male, this would be some sort of crime and would go against policy, and you should take it to HR and even the police so the oppressors can be brought to justice. Sure, great. Sort of not the point, though. And of course, so this was only a couple of years ago, and when we started an online event called LGBT STEM Day, which happens every year, celebrating LGBTQ plus people in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Quite active on Twitter and social media. And these will be some of the responses. Now, I will apologize in advance for some of the incredibly disturbing language. There aren't any pictures, but this is the sort of thing that sort of creeps in, and this is the sort of thing that permeates, even on a low level, some of the stuff that we do. Maybe y'all can find a cure for AIDS. Yeah, several folks I know are working on it. So, thank you for that, Levi of Texas. And just, before we think this isn't just some sort of, random people going off, earlier this week was Museum Selfie Day. So I posted a picture of myself in our collection here at the museum. And that was this response that I got within 2 hours. Sexualized ornithology. Heaven forbid he ever comes across a bird of paradise who does a fantastic mating dance, or a duck penis, because, and it reminded me very much of this cartoon by Alex Norris, which I think sort of, encapsulates how society still perceives and interacts with queer people. We're often reduced to a sex act or our genitals, which is, clearly we're much more than that. So really, it's the little things. I get asked pretty regularly what my wife does. So I'm married. I've been married for 10 years. I have a wedding ring. So what does your wife do? Well, kind of don't have one. Checking into a hotel room with my husband, we've been offered 2 twin beds instead of a double bed. And even just whenever relationships are expressed in popular culture, so think of song lyrics, how often do you hear it being about a same-sex partner? You usually don't. And if you do, it's noteworthy. Some things that my straight friends and colleagues might not appreciate, is the constant asking yourself, is it safe to hold hands? Certainly something that we think about quite a lot here in the UK, and we definitely thought about when we lived in Newfoundland. Watching the crowd and regularly plotting escape. I mean, it sounds a bit dramatic, but when you're in a new space and you're going to be interacting socially, you need to have a way out. And each of these on their own isn't fatal. but they still hurt, and they're still a bit of a pain in the arse. So just on the question about, is it safe to hold hands? A lot of straight people say, oh, poo-poo, come on. Yes, of course you can hold hands. This is a report from the European Fundamental Rights Agency, which looked across the EU 27, plus a few adjacent countries, including the UK. And the map that you see shows the proportion of same-sex people who said they avoid holding hands in public for fear of being assaulted, threatened, or harassed. And you can definitely see some darker colors there, especially in Eastern Europe, Poland, Serbia, Croatia, Macedonia. But if you look at some of the other countries, so like the UK, for example, and Ireland, 37%. That's more than a third of same-sex couples in the UK avoid holding hands in public. That's pretty damning. On the right is an infographic from The Guardian, which covered this report, which sort of puts it on a different scale. And when you look at those numbers, even if you look at sort of the best performing countries, which are on the left, so that's Austria, Lithuania, and Finland, they're all still, more than a third, which is a non-trivial amount. And respondents who've experienced harassment for any reason in the past 12 months, you can see the UK up there at about 62%, and I can certainly include myself in that category. Because it's also the big things. In the UK, we have what's called the British Social Attitude Survey. This is a survey that was started in the early 1980s to gauge the general public's feeling on social attitudes and a variety of issues, run out of one of the universities here in England. And this is the question, sexual relations between two adults of the same sex are not wrong at all. How many of you believe that, essentially, from 1983 to 2018? And we can see it dipped pretty low. So in the late 80s, when I was sitting there on that water fountain at the mini golf course ready for my close-up, 10% is pretty low. And we saw obviously an increase of that in the 90s, which came along with equalized age of consent. From the UK, the age of consent was different between opposite sex and same-sex partners. And then civil partnerships in 2004 and marriage in 2013. But the thing to point out really here is that even in 2018, it's still only at 70%. That's 30% of the population that believes that my marriage is wrong. And that, again, will be pervading society. So queer folks are at higher risk of poor mental health. They're at a greater occurrence of depression, suicidal thoughts, self-harm, alcohol and drug use. As we saw earlier, they're more likely to be assaulted, experience harassment, and discriminatory remarks. And I looked up the hate crime stats for the UK, which records crimes based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And I don't think we need a t-test to show that there's a general linear trend going on here, and it's not in the right direction. So, how on earth does this relate to birds? I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the shearwater and the bottle cap. So you can see the bottle cap there. It's some sort of soft drink brand that ends in KE. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about that. This is the stomach of a flesh-footed shearwater in Australia, which is where I've been working for the last decade or so. You can clearly see there's a nice round bottle cap in there. And when we go and dissect these birds, we find heaps and heaps of identifiable items. Most of them are single use, and the vast majority of them are sort of consumer products, the ones that we can identify. So how did this part of the journey start? Well, this one for me started on a Qantas flight in 2009. This is Lord Howe Island off the east coast of Australia. It's about a 2.5-hour flight east of Sydney in this little wee Dash 8, which I'm sure many of you in Newfoundland will know well. It's one of the shortest runways in the Southern Hemisphere. So when the plane actually takes off, essentially put the parking brake on, rev the engine, drop the brake, and scoot off the runway. It's pretty thrilling. But in 2009, because it's a really expensive flight, as a lot of flights to remote places are, you get a free meal. Hurrah! And this was the meal that we got. So what you can see here, we've got a plastic container of water with a separate plastic cup, plastic cutlery wrapped in plastic with a plastic wrapped Toblerone bar, a plastic wrapped sandwich, which is also in plastic, with a plastic wrapped cookie in a clamshell of plastic. It's quite a lot, really. Being the scientist that I was, when the flight crew came around to clean things up, I surreptitiously slipped it in my carry-on bag and took it to the lab. So that plastic there was 55.5 grams. Now we can do a little extrapolation because we're scientists. A Dash 8 of this model holds 40 people a flight. There's 9 flights a week. Quickly do your sums. Yep, you're all there? Yeah, no, of course you are. 2.1 tons a year. That's just on this one flight. And that's all single use. And for me, that was what sort of first brought home so the amount of waste that's generated. Plastic has a really interesting history. It was sort of developed as part of a competition to find a substitute for ivory in billiard balls. Very noble idea, of course. And the first real plastic was called Bakelite, which is a phenol and formaldehyde polymer. And now plastics is a really broad term. There's not just one thing that's plastic. You've got acrylics, polyesters, silicones, polyurethanes, halogenated, all this sort of thing. And if you look on anything that you recycle, you see that number in the sort of 3-arrow recycle symbol. That refers to the polymers that were in it. So, for example, 1 is PET, which are things like a lot of drink bottles. 2 is high-density polyethylene. This is the sort of hard, rigid plastics. But I want to draw your attention to number 7, which is other, or MISC. And that literally covers everything from cling film, toothbrush bristles, ABS. That's what this mouse is made of. Polycarbonates. I've got CDs in here. Do people still buy CDs? Like glasses. And that's the category that's really, really hard to do anything with. And the thing that we've got to remember is that plastic ultimately is forever. So in Canada, we looked up a couple of stats last year. It employs about 4,500 people as a $5 billion industry. But last numbers I can find, which were from about 2017, is only 8% of that is actually recycled. And we think about sort of the public service campaigns that were on in the 80s and 90s. It was all reduce, reuse, recycle. You're supposed to reduce first, reuse what you can, and then what you can't reduce or reuse, you should be recycling. So it's really the last step. But still, only 8% of it is getting there. There's a lot of plastic floating around in the ocean at the moment. Between 4 and 13 million tons go in every year. And by comparison, some of the best estimates for the number of birds in the world, that's the number of individuals. So you think of, the ducks down at Bowring Park, or the gulls in the harbor, or, starlings out in Ballyhaley Golf Course. That's, between 1 and 10 kilos of plastic for every individual bird is floating out in the ocean. And 20 million more items enter the ocean every day on average. Because the thing about plastic is it doesn't break down, it just breaks up. People say, oh, plastic just breaks down. I mean, that implies that it goes away. It doesn't, it just breaks up into ever smaller and smaller pieces. And, sort of the first link that we'll draw here between these two parts of my talk is each piece on their own is probably not fatal, but they still hurt. And together they can start to cause problems. So in the 1960s was sort of when we recognized that birds were ingesting plastics. That's pretty soon after plastics became a real common thing in manufacturing, sort of in the post-war era. And it was Carl Kenyon and Gene Cridler, who worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who found the first case of plastics in Laysan albatrosses on Midway Atoll in northwest Hawaii. This is the picture from the paper. You can see all sorts of things in there, which they called undigestible matter. So you've got plastic, you've got stones, pumice, squid beaks. And this was sort of the first example, really, that brought attention to the issue that birds were ingesting plastic. And the interesting thing about Carl Kenyon, and I didn't find this out until several years later, he passed away in 2009 and had an obituary written in the Auk, which is a major North American ornithological journal, which mentioned that he was survived by his companion of 39 years, Clarence Larson, which for me was a nice closing of that circle. But equally, somebody that I had, read his papers and, idolized his work for a long time, and I had no idea that he was gay. So if we look at Laysan albatrosses again, so there's the dot from Kenyon and Cridler's paper in the 1960s. We were last there in 2012. And this is essentially the trend in the number of birds, albatross chicks with plastic in them. Not to say that it's causing any issues, but that's just the straight number. And we can go back and we can see these photos taken by the excellent photographer Chris Jordan, which look very similar to the ones that Carl took in the 1960s. Right, so how are things in Canada? We actually know very little. Canada's got 91 breeding seabirds, but we've only looked in about a third of them for plastic ingestion. And some of that's because we know that they're unlikely to ingest plastic. Things like Franklin's gull, which breed in the boreal forest in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, Ontario, are unlikely to encounter plastic in any significant quantities. But some of them, we generally would think. In only 15 species do we have any information for more than 1 year or more than one site. And of those, we've only got 6 where that's multiple sites and multiple years. So that's leeches, storm petrels, herring gulls, thick-billed and common murres, northern gannets because they build it into their nests, same with double-crested cormorants, and ingestion by northern fulmars. So what does plastic do when it actually gets into the bloodstream? What we've been doing at Adrift Lab is trying to understand the sublethal impacts of plastics. And that's because, typically we assume, or the measure of an impact is that, is the bird dead and washed up on the beach? But if I ask, how are you doing today? And your only options are alive and dead, that's pretty crude. Doesn't give you a lot of wiggle room. So you can have a bird that's alive and seemingly on the outside healthy, but you have no idea what's going on internally with its physiology. So we took a heap of blood samples and sent them off to a veterinary lab in Australia and found that birds with plastic had lower blood calcium. These are chicks. Lower blood calcium, so that implies some issues with bone growth. Higher cholesterol. We all have an idea of what high cholesterol does. We know that they weighed less. They grow more slowly than their plastic-free counterparts. And what the top sort of 6 plots there show you, that's just presence and absence. So just the presence of a single piece was enough to influence that significant relationship. And for some of them, like calcium, amylase, uric acid, there was a relationship between the number of pieces or the mass of plastic as well. And on the outside, aside from being slightly underweight, you could view these as being outwardly healthy birds. So Peter Puskic, who did his PhD with us, did a literature review on sublethal effects of plastic. And basically, he found only 13 studies. So we think, plastic, we've been talking about this for years now. There's still only 13 studies that have ever looked at sublethal impacts in vertebrates, non-fish vertebrates. Mostly on birds, a few on mammals, only 1 on amphibians. So there's clearly a heck of a lot more that we need to do to try and understand what the impact, if any, of this plastic ingestion is having. So to shift tack slightly, I will take you now to the middle of nowhere, or more properly, the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This is the Pitcairn Islands, which is a UK overseas territory, famous for being the place where the mutineers from the Bounty, HMS Bounty, arrived in 1789. This is Henderson Island. It's a raised coral atoll, so it's coral that's been uplifted between 50 and 100 feet. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, 43 square kilometers, 5 endemic bird species, heaps of endemic plants. A generally just absolutely gorgeous place to work. And I was lucky enough to go there for a month in 2019. Very difficult to get to. No one lives there. You fly to French Polynesia, get on a boat for 3 days, go east, you'll get to Pitcairn, and then go east for another day and a half, and you'll get to Henderson. As you can see our research boat there, the Silver Supporter, the little red dot near the horizon. And this is East Beach, which faces east, as you can imagine. The next island east of Henderson, aside from the small atoll of Ducie in the Pitcairn Islands, is Easter Island. So that gives you an idea of where it is. If you go north, you basically hit, the west coast of Washington, Vancouver Island, and British Columbia. And this is a picture of East Beach from 1991. Looks like, many tropical beaches, many non-tropical beaches looking at the clouds. And when we went there in 2015, this is what the beach had become. And at the time, it was the most polluted remote beach in the world. So we found 38 million pieces of plastic weighing about 17 tons on this 2-kilometer stretch of beach, 5,000 kilometers from anywhere. And so the question is, why is it this bad? You've got, here you've got a crab in an Avon cosmetics bottle. You've got abandoned fishing gear trapped on the coral reefs. There's a dead green sea turtle trapped in some fishing rope, and a whole bunch of microplastics that have washed up on the tide from the day before. And Henderson's in this really awkward place because it's in the middle of the South Pacific Gyre, which is this massive surface current. There's one in each of the 5 oceanic basins. And that means it concentrates anything that floats, including plastic debris. And why is this beach debris also bad? Well, it can impact nutrient cycling, stuff can get entangled in it. And when we were there in 2019, we noticed a lot of bottles had these shells in them. And it turns out that hermit crabs were getting trapped because their little legs couldn't get purchase on this smooth plastic surface. Think of it like, trying to walk up some streets downtown when it's really icy. You can't really do it, so you get stuck at the bottom. The thing with hermit crabs is because they don't have a shell of their own, they need to take shells from other people or other animals. And when a hermit crab dies, it gives off a chemical signal which tells its hermit crab friends, hey, there's a new shell around. So they come marching in and they slide into the bottle and they die. And they give off this chemical signal. And then more crabs come, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see the problem that it's having. So in that one white bottle that you see there, which is a bottle that used to have an agricultural pesticide, found 585 dead hermit crabs, some of which are photographed there on the bottom. And when we did a survey of this beach and the Cocos Keeling Islands in the Indian Ocean, and we reckon there's probably about 500,000 dead hermit crabs just on these 2 islands. We don't know how long they've been there. Chances are it's going to be less than a year, but that's a significant impact on these ecosystems because hermit crabs are really key for cycling nutrients and getting rid of, they're detritivores. They'll eat just anything, scavenge anything on the beach. So, right, what can we do? That's depressing enough. It requires basically engagement at a bunch of different levels. First off, internationally. So on the right here, you can see gray is carbon emissions, blue is plastic production. It's increasing exponentially. And if you look at, again in the gray, these are sort of our climate change agreements. So Rio in '92, we recognized there's an issue. Kyoto put in non-binding targets, and then the Paris Convention, which does in fact influence more than just the residents of Paris, put in these binding targets. And that's sort of the progression that we've had. And if we look at plastics, we first sort of recognized it internationally in the 1970s with MARPOL, which is a convention for dumping waste at sea. But even at the Honolulu strategy and the Rio Plus 20 and the Clean Seas Initiative, it doesn't matter what these are. Basically, these are still recognizing that there's a problem. We haven't even approached targets. So when we say international policy around plastics, because plastic floats around everywhere. On Henderson, we found bottles and other items from all over the world: Spain, UK, as well as South America, the US, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. Once they get into the ocean, they literally travel everywhere. And think about where we are with climate change in terms of policy internationally. We're 30 years behind that with plastics. That requires international cooperation and political engagement. There's public pressure and personal changes, but that can only get us so far. So the idea that we can solve the plastic problem by, all using bamboo toothbrushes or bringing our carrier bags to the grocery store, no, that's not going to be the one that solves the problem. And there was an analysis done just late last year that said if we basically take all the mitigation measures that we have at the moment, plastic will still increase over the next 50 years. So, we still have quite a ways to go. Again, looking at policy, these are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are essentially aspirational things that countries agree and sign up to in the broader context of human development. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to number 14, which is life below water, and particularly target 14.1. So by 2025, prevent and significantly reduce marine pollution of all kinds, in particular from land-based activities, including marine debris and nutrient pollution. So, again, we can't measure this. We don't know what's out there to even know if we've prevented and significantly reduced it. We don't know what our baseline is. There's still so much work left to do. And I'll also highlight a couple of other ones here that feed into things more broadly. One is obviously good health and well-being. We'll look at some statistics later on queer folks in STEM and that, but also, plastics get into our food. It's in tea, it's in beer, it's in salt. If I would wager dollars to donuts that every one of us has some plastic unintentionally in us now. So again, it's the little things that add up. So during the course of this talk, 300,000 new plastic items will enter the ocean. 90% of those will be from consumer products, and the vast majority will literally have been designed to be used once and then discarded. This constant checking of products for the amount of plastic, that sort of personal step that you can take, is really tiring and saddening. Trust me, I've been doing it for a long time. And that's, again, links to some of the things that we were talking about earlier. So how on earth am I going to link these two things together? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about queering science. Again, as a bit of a throwback to Queer as Folk, this was designed by my friend Kevin Bergio. And we can approach science from a queer perspective. And some colleagues of mine here in the UK put together what they call the Queer Science Manifesto, which is a set of goals or aspirations or ways that we can take what we know from queer activism and culture and community and apply it to scientific culture, community, and inquiry. So first of all, it's all inclusive. So yes, I'm here today. It has an unapologetic agenda. I do remember being at MUN and having rather fiery discussions with faculty and with fellow PhD students about whether scientists should be advocates. And in my mind, this is something that we just can't be neutral on. Neutrality in this case is complicity. Queer science doesn't just go to the moon, it pays for accessibility, insists that any people with any kinds of bodies can dream of being astronauts and works with them to achieve that goal. It doesn't just revere the past, but it questions the shoulders of the giants that came before and who they, how they were able to stand up so proudly and who they might have stood on, exploited, or even killed to get there, which is something that we seldom recognized in science. It celebrates collaboration and community over individualism and ego, and it fights for a more just world. And that approach to science and to the questions that we ask and how we ask them has influenced the direction that we've taken in the Adrift Lab. And there's the link for the Queer Science Manifesto. Honestly, if you just Google Queer Science Manifesto, it will come up. Brian, Carolyn, and Erinma are absolutely amazing. So why does this all matter? You know, surely we're all, you know, fantastic, enlightened, small L liberal, you know, folks in academe. Well, here comes the data. Right, so the first paper I'm going to talk about is Yoder and Matthias, which looked at how open queer folks in STEM were in different different contexts. So while most folks were more out to friends and family, a significant portion were not out to colleagues or students, and like not at all. That proportion of openness tends to be driven by the field of study. So fields that have greater gender parity, assuming a gender binary, tend to have more folks who are open professionally. And also people are more out if they feel their workplace is safe, if they feel welcomed, and if they have the same levels of support as their straight colleagues. This should not be surprising, and yet here we are. We're quantifying the obvious. Coming to the UK, this was a climate survey done in the physical sciences by the Institute of Physics, Royal Astronomical Society, and Royal Society of Chemistry. Leaving their workplace, you know, 28% of LGBT respondents compared with only 16% of our straight colleagues. That's, you know, almost twice, and certainly also high for trans scientists. Out to everyone at work, and I think, you know, for me, the one here that's particularly surprising is the one on the far right, which is gay. 44%. I would have thought that would be much higher, but it isn't. And this was a quote from one of the respondents: "It's only when people feel comfortable to be themselves in the workplace without any fear of discrimination will global science truly be able to thrive." And a few other numbers. So, you know, almost 20%, 1 in 5 had experienced exclusionary behavior, some issues around policy, and general support. So working outside academia, don't have access to a workplace LGBT network. And we know that community of peers is really important. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about this paper, which just came out, honestly, like a week and a half ago, and is absolutely brilliant. It was a survey of about 25,000 individuals across 21 professional science bodies. Level of agreement, yeah, I've got the same career opportunities. No, lower. Queer folks have fewer resources and are less comfortable whistleblowing than our straight colleagues. We often are more likely to feel devalued in a professional context than our straight colleagues. And we feel more socially excluded than our straight colleagues. Again, all in a professional context in STEM. Experienced harassment, again, quite high, again, significant. There's 3 asterisks there. And have an increased, frequency of health challenges, whether that's minor health problems, insomnia, stress, depression, than our straight colleagues. These are all corrected for field of study, career stage. Basically, these are direct comparisons between these two populations. Right, it's 1:45. We'll wrap up. Why am I here? To me, it's because visibility and representation really matter. When I was a grad student at MUN, I met one other out queer scientist, and that was a visiting seminar speaker who came from Berkeley in 2009. And that was the only other out LGBTQ scientist that I met in my 4 years in Newfoundland. At LGBT STEM, we run what we call the LGBT Steminar, which is a one-day science conference for queer folks. We just had our 6th one online about 2 weeks ago. And some of the feedback, one of the most profound experiences of my life, to go into something and say, it filled me with abject wonder. And I'll draw your attention to the last one. This was after we held our event at the Institute of Physics in London, which had a giant TV screen with a rainbow flag on it. How many other conferences have you, seen or feel that? And so, this person said, I got a bit choked up when I walked in and saw this massive rainbow. It overwhelmed me to walk into a room and feel so immediately validated and completely welcome. And this is important because, it's a conference where you can be yourself. And no matter how out you are, I've been shouting about queer stuff for, 15, 20 years now. You still self-censor when you're in an academic conference that's not with people that are not LGBTQ. And this was sort of the sort of generic statement. Like, do you remember the first time you saw a queer person really owning it and like giving you the confidence to be yourself? And the thing for every queer person to know is that you are that person to someone. So now for some slightly more sad things. Science is an international pursuit, whether that's in collaboration, conferences, fieldwork, and unfortunately protections across the world for LGBTQ plus people are not equal. There's 11 countries where I could be put to death and about 50 where I could be imprisoned just for being me. And these are some countries that I'd absolutely love to visit. I'd love to go to Namibia. I'd absolutely love to see some of the culture in Zambia and Mozambique, but I'm not going to be going there because I won't be protected legally. You can see the darker the blue, the more protection countries have. This is accurate up until about last month. So some huge areas where folks might be researching or working with collaborators. And if we look at the visitors to the LGBTQ plus STEM blog, which publishes short interviews with queer scientists, you can see there's some overlap. About 1% of our visitors come from places where being queer is illegal. And I like to think that that's giving queer folks in those countries a bit of, a bright rainbow light.
Maybe they're the secret police.
Yeah, they could definitely be the secret police. Folks get arrested pretty regularly in a whole bunch of different countries. There was a British man arrested in the UAE for brushing past somebody else in a bar to not spill his drink. It was interpreted as a same-sex act, and he was in prison for 3 months.
I don't think that was turned off.
And then ultimately, because myself and some others sort of shout about this quite a lot, we do get messages out of the blue, which I'm always happy to receive. But it's pretty sobering when you see that pop up in your inbox. You can't ignore that. I can thankfully report that this person is no longer in Iraq and is in a safe third country. Right, so like plastics, we see a pretty a progression, basically. We've got equality. This is, there's a problem, there's a fence in the way, but everyone's got the same thing. There's equity, which is sort of the mitigation of plastics, in which we can see over the fence, but the fence is still there. And ultimately, what we want to be striving for, there's the reality, which is some people are way up above and some people are way down below, and have much more than they actually need. When in reality, what we want is liberation, which is the solution, and the removal of that systematic barrier, removal of that fence. So I'll wrap up just with a bit of a nod to any of my queer members of the audience, and that's that we're all leaders. The queer community is reasonably small, and the more people that talk about it, the better. Like I said, you're going to be that role model for somebody at some point. Be the person you wish you had in your own life. When I was a kid growing up in New Brunswick and Newfoundland, even a grad student and postdoc, I really wish I had another queer scientist to talk to about some of the challenges that I had. But importantly, stay safe and build support, because it is bloody exhausting. As a good friend of mine, Ben Britton, pointed out today, we get asked quite a lot to give talks about being queer in STEM, which I'm obviously very happy to do. That's a talk that I'm not giving about my science, or that I'm not giving about our research or about our collections. And that's a burden that my straight colleagues don't have. I'll wrap up just with a slide of thanks, because good science ultimately happens because of good people. There's definitely some MUN folks on there, and without whom, I wouldn't be able to talk to you about shearwaters and plastic, and the Steminar and LGBTQ STEM. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Alex. I think everyone agrees with me. That was an excellent talk. Thank you very much for joining us. At this point, we're open for questions. So the way we'll do this is, if you have a question, please make yourself known in the chat in some way, and I'll call people out in order. And at that point, you can ask your question. And feel free to turn on your mic or turn on your camera if you'd like while you're asking your question.
I have a question. I can start us off. First of all, thank you so much. That was super interesting. I really liked how you tied in your research. I have a question about things that non-queer folk can do in academia and also in real life, just to kind of make things easier on queer folk. So what do you think about using partner, just generally everyone using that, and everybody putting their pronouns in emails and on Twitter and stuff? Do you think that's helpful?
I think it is, but only if you're safe and comfortable doing so. So, for some trans folks, they are not yet at the stage where putting their pronouns in their bio is something they're safe doing, which is absolutely fine. But if you are, don't make it mandatory. You can certainly encourage it. Yeah. You can, incidentally, some of us you can see here, you can also do it to your Zoom name. It's always a good one if you're in a meeting, just to read the room.
All right, thanks, Kelly. Next, I think Yolanda.
Sure, thanks. All right, thanks, Alex. Fabulous talk. It's great to see another one of your talks. So yeah, my question kind of follows a little bit on Justine's, but so your comment really struck for me is like, your advice to your queer colleagues is, be the person that you wish you had in your life. So what kind of a person can I be when I'm standing in front of my undergraduates as a straight person for the queer folk sitting there in the seats? What advice would you give?
So I guess there's a couple of different things there. Signal in I mean, it's incredibly silly that we have to be saying signal in some way that you're not a bigot, but like having some various campuses that I've been on have had sort of like safe space stickers on office doors and that sort of thing. But constantly challenge yourself with the material that you're using to teach as well. If you're, how many times would you mention something that, even in ecology, which we do all the time, there's heteronormative language that creeps in there. And do you have to frame it in that way, or is there a more inclusive way that you could be, framing some of these concepts. But also, I think, just being aware, if a student comes to you and says, right, who do I talk to? Being aware of what campus resources are around as well. I mean, when I was at MUN, there was jack all. There may still well be jack all. I don't know.
I think it's a bit better, but yes.
But and then maybe push for what folks might want. But yeah, I think take the lead from the communities that you want to work with. I mean, it's the same as doing research in remote communities, in a sense. A lot of us do that. We don't go barging in and saying, right, I'm going to research X, Y, and Z because I think it's important. You work with that local community to co-develop questions and lines of inquiry and build a collaboration. Queer science is collaborative and all-inclusive, that sort of thing. So, that you have to take a bit from that as well, I think.
Cool, thanks.
All right, Justine.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your talk, Alex, and making all your experiences, like making yourself vulnerable. I really, really appreciate that. If I can do a two-tiered question, one queer, one plastics, that would be really appreciated. Cool, right on. I'm like, so much to pick from. So firstly, I kind of came in late to the conversation, so unfortunately I didn't see the first part of your presentation. But with regards to doing field work, do you think that it should be a stipulation by the institutions, universities, professors to provide a safe guide on how to conduct yourself if you're queer entering remote spaces or small communities, and whether or not your experiences kind of involved that with the projects you worked on?
Yeah, sure. This is a really great one because it's something that we talk a lot about, especially here in the UK. A lot of campuses run field courses in West Africa. I interviewed for a job at a university which shall remain nameless, which only at the interview stage did I realize it involved, teaching a field course in Ghana, where I would not have gone. Universities will have a health and safety obligation. We all, I think, now fill out risk assessments for things like travel. And that should absolutely, for any international travel, but even not international travel, just, travel to remote places where, things may not be quite so rosy, should definitely include that. And I think at the moment, it's going to be incumbent on the person doing that work to flag that as a risk and suggest ways to mitigate it. But also, once that's done, whoever the, to put my corporate hat on, because I'm not at a university, whoever that risk manager is, so whoever is going to be back at headquarters dealing with it, if you call from Zambia and say, I've been arrested, how do you resolve that in an effective way? And, for faculty who supervise field work, and even students that supervise fieldwork, what do you do if one of your queer students calls and says, right, I need to get home right now? I would, again, bet my life savings, small that they are, that no one knows. And it would just all be floundering around and best guesses, which is sadly the norm. Have I had any negative experiences? Yeah, I worked on Tristan da Cunha for 8 months, island in the South Atlantic Ocean, British Overseas Territory. It's literally halfway between South Africa and Brazil. You get on a ship in Cape Town and go west for 11 days. It's a really small community, and the relationships that we had with some of the members of that community were fraught, and I suspect some of it is because I was gay and queer. But no one actually comes out and says that. So it's really hard to pin that down. You just know that they don't like you, but you don't know if they don't like you because of who you are or for what you're doing or for some other reason or what. It's insidious like that.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that answer. And sorry if I don't mean to hog the mic, but my second question relates to plastics. And obviously you've been in the field super long, you've seen the trends. The pandemic we're experiencing now with COVID-19 and this kind of reversion to takeout packaging, PPE use, single-use culture, do you feel like within your scope of experience that this is going to have long-lasting effects on society's kind of crutch towards using single-use plastics, and whether or not we're going to have to start campaigning from the ground up for reducing plastics?
Yeah, a great question. And I know, I mean, you guys have been doing all sorts of like PPE surveys as well, haven't you? Yeah. Ultimately, though, I don't have a fundamental problem with plastics as compounds or as a class of compounds. The issue is how we manage the waste. So, I think increasingly, the focus has to be on plugging these gaps in waste management streams. Reducing the plastic that we use as individuals is only going to get us so far. And there's some things that we just can't replace plastic. We can't replace it with something else, at least not economically at the moment. So there's that side of things as well. A bamboo toothbrush is 2 or 3 times the cost of a plastic toothbrush at the moment. So I think, basically plug those holes in waste management streams, because that's going to be, I think, where we'll see the biggest net impact at the moment. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. So, we may as well start there.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that.
All right, Ian.
Hi, Alex. Great talk. I just remember being in Anchorage with our research group. We'd arrived there. I can't remember if it was 2008 or 2009 or 2010. But you and I were standing in the parking lot of the Puffin Inn, and we were looking at the room that you and I were about to go into and share. And I nervously said, the administration would find it totally unacceptable if I proposed to share this room with one of my female students, but they have, it's ridiculous. They have no, they have nothing, it doesn't even occur to them that there might be issues with me sharing the room with you. I just wonder if you remember this. I want to apologize that, to say I certainly could have done better, but in the circumstances, I think we shrugged our shoulders and laughed and shouldered on. But I honestly, in retrospect, I don't think that was the right thing for me to do. Anyway, I'm going to turn my mic off now, but great talk. Thank you. Maybe you remember the anecdote.
Thanks, Ian. I genuinely don't. I legitimately do not remember that at all. And, I think that comes down to, the fact that it just sort of happens on a regular, and you sort of, get used to it and shrug it off. In retrospect, I can't remember what the policy was at the time, or even there was a policy. But it's that heteronormative treatment of interactions as being the problematic, or potentially problematic ones, that I think, definitely needs to be addressed if it hasn't been already. But yeah, genuinely don't remember it.
All right, Miguel.
Hey, there we go. Hey, Alex, man, that was a really great talk. Thank you so much for giving it. It was very enlightening for sure. I can say certainly, like, being raised in a place like Bermuda has a very complicated history. It's been historically homophobic, unfortunately. And in fact, Bermuda is like the first country in the world to like repeal same-sex marriage after making it legal. But now it's legal again, which is like amazing. And I don't know, it's just so funny that, I don't know, I guess I never thought that this sort of fear existed much like in the science community. Like, I think of like athletes who are like afraid to come out and things like that because they're afraid to lose like maybe their sponsors and their job, how the fans would react. And I guess I never thought like scientists themselves could experience that same kind of thing. So, but anyway, to educate some of the people at home, one of the arguments some of the older Bermudians will use is like, oh, it's a taught thing and it's not right and it's a human behavior. So I actually study terns in Bermuda that form same-sex pairs. And I often use that like as an argument to educate some of the locals here that, no, like same-sex interactions goes well beyond humans. And then sometimes they're like, oh, well, they probably can't even they can't raise their offspring properly. And I said, well, it's funny you say that because we did an experiment where we translocated fertile clutch of tern eggs to a same-sex tern pair, 2 females. And they hatched the chicks, they reared them, the chicks fledged successfully, and we actually confirmed last summer that chicks from the same-sex pair actually came back as adults to join the population. So I think now like Bermudians are slowly. It's amazing how I have to use like a bird example to hit the get the point across. But now I think they're like, okay, you've got a point. I see what you mean. I'm being a bit of a bigot. And it's like, yeah, but but anyway, I guess the point is, I don't know, maybe just. I guess we as scientists, especially animal ecologists, we can make some of these examples, bring them to light to, let people know, like, yeah, like same-sex interactions definitely occur. They're very prevalent among the animal kingdom. And I think that maybe that's another avenue we can use to just educate like the general public. But that's all I wanted to say. But great talk, man. It was good.
Yeah, don't even get me started on things like fungi and plants. There's a fantastic book by Joan Roughgarden called Evolution's Rainbow, which goes into a lot of detail about this sort of thing. So yeah, if anyone's keen, it's a really great read. And fun fact, the first depiction of same-sex behavior in the animal kingdom in the scientific literature was a pair of arthropods, which are, and I kid you not, called cockchafers.
Nice. I dig it. Oh, P.S. You mentioned in your slide that you're thinking about music and how it's not often like referenced. I don't know if you know this artist by the name of Troye Sivan. Really, really good artist, and he sings about like being in relationships like with his male partners and whatnot. So if you haven't ever heard of him, look up his music. Troye Sivan, really good. Okay, I'm done.
Cheers. Thanks, Miguel.
No worries, man.
All right, we got Jake next, I think.
Yeah, great talk, Alex. I always kind of enjoy your talks. They just seem so nice and so refreshing, I guess, from someone that is also kind of like out. It's kind of nice to get those people in science that you can look up to. For a question kind of about plastic and how it's been increasing over the last few years, have you seen any like changes in the behavior of birds or any kind of like breeding changes as a result due to these increases in plastics that kind of are everywhere and in all the oceans?
Yeah, great question. Short answer, no. And I think that's because, plastics they're increasing exponentially, and a lot of seabirds are really long-lived. So they haven't had that evolutionary time to adapt yet. You certainly see, species like gannets adding it into their nests, and that may have, some beneficial, or indeed, well, we know it has negative impact because chicks get entangled in it and then die on the nest. You can see this at some particularly affected colonies here in the UK. We looked at this with Bill Montevecchi and Paul Regulars, another MUN alum, and a couple of others. We looked at this at Funk and Cape St. Mary's and Bacalou in about 2007. And because of the groundfish closure in Newfoundland in '92, the amount of debris in the ocean in those areas around those gannet colonies has really fallen off. And that's related to the amount of debris that they incorporated into their nests. But yeah, you can definitely see some impacts, at least on that level. Is it, are we starting to see selection on an evolutionary scale? I think we're still too early to say, unfortunately.
All right, Jack.
Hey, that was unsurprisingly a fantastic talk, as always. I was thinking a bit about your slide near the end, kind of discussing like prioritizing, I suppose, activism or like non-strictly science work and how that creates a demand upon your time that other folks don't have to deal with. Not a simple answer, I'm sure, but like, what is your personal philosophy around that? Or how do you decide how much time to devote to your career versus asking for a friend?
Yeah. Yeah, good to see you, Jack. And yeah, and happy to chat about this at length. It's really complicated. It depends on how much capacity I've got on at the moment. It depends on how many of these I've done recently. It depends who's asking. Yeah, it's really tough because surprise, surprise, the world's pretty shit. People ask, what's it like being a queer scientist? And I say, think of all of the challenges of being a scientist. You've got, degree, university pressures, pressure to publish, to get a grant, to get a scholarship, to get a job, to find a postdoc. You've got all of that, and then throw the queer stuff on top of that. And it's not additive; it's multiplicative. I'm pretty lucky at the moment. I've got a job. It's permanent, and it's a job that lets me shout about rainbow things whenever I want. So I take that not to an extreme, but I take it pretty liberally, because for me, I never had this. Like, nobody would have dreamt of giving a seminar on queers in science when I was a grad student. Like, no, it just wouldn't. Until I moved to the UK in 2014, I literally had met 2 queer scientists. One was that visiting prof from Berkeley, and one was when I was in Saskatoon, and they were a prof at Regina, which is 300 kilometers away. We were definitely around because we're everywhere, but there wasn't that connection or that recognition, and that mentorship, I think, is really, really important. And so that's why I, particularly for places like MUN, would say yes. But yeah, it's I haven't been asked to do a research talk in almost a year now, so, and that might change. But yeah, it's there's no set rule, I'm afraid. But yeah, it's a tough one.
I'll just say, Alex, we were just chatting about getting you back next year to do a talk on your research. So maybe, but I think Cole has a question too.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for joining our seminar series for this week, Alex. I had a question. You threw up a stat about the number of, I don't know if those are research items that explore the sublethal effects of plastics on birds.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just because of the fact that I guess how lethal plastics are, and like the phthalates they're releasing, the endocrine disruptors, that the lag between, I guess, the time from plastic consumption to when you can maybe measure an effect is they're so lethal that you're not going to be able to measure some sublethal effects. I don't know. Do you have any idea, like, is it tricky to measure these because there's such a lethality, I guess, within the plastic consumption?
So spoiler alert, there isn't. Pinpointing a bird that we can say definitively has died from plastic ingestion is pretty impossible. We know that there are birds floating around in the ocean, flying around right now, that have plastic in them. And, they might live for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. A single piece is probably not going to kill a bird. If it's a single piece of, I don't know, hard, rigid plastic. So yeah, ultimately it's not, well, we do not know how many birds are killed by plastic, but chances are it's not going to be that many, because we're not finding heaps and heaps of dead birds with plastic in them. That's restricted to really just a few species. Lots of birds floating around in the ocean, flying around, have small amounts of plastic in them and are otherwise seemingly alive. And that's why this, alive versus dead thing is so incredibly crude. How long does it take? Yeah, that's another brilliant question. The birds that we work with are all chicks, so they're about 90 days old. Just when they're leaving their burrow for the first time is when we sample them. So it's not that long, really. They only get fed every 4 days or so. So in reality, you're only looking at about 20 meals over the span of 3 months. So yeah, I think we still have a lot to learn and understand about what plastics do and how they do it. And I think that the fact that we've only seen 13 studies of that have looked at sublethal effects more speaks to the challenge in actually measuring it, because most people work with dead birds. It's pretty hard to measure sublethal effects in a bird that's already dead. There's very few groups like us that are we stomach pump the birds. We flush their stomachs with water and they regurgitate the plastic out. There's not many groups in the world that are doing that. So I think that's probably why there's so few.
Cool, thank you.
I have one more question if you've got any time, Alex. I think we're coming up on 2:15 here. Okay, great. It's another queer question. Sorry. Lately I've been thinking about this idea of like do I guess queer people have a responsibility to be out in science? I guess you talked a little bit about that. I suppose if it's safe, like that's a factor. Do you have any suggestions for like I guess I'm thinking about like different aspects of an academic career. Like you've got like I guess your university community, and then like maybe like government or agency partners or other folks. Like if you feel comfortable in some environments but not others, and there's like few degrees of separation, I guess, between different parts of your academic career, how do you kind of navigate something like that? Or do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, gosh. I mean, every situation is different. I think it comes down to, first and foremost, be safe and look out for yourself. Yeah, don't. It is tough, and I genuinely don't have an answer. I mean, friends of mine, work in Nigeria. Queer friends of mine work in Nigeria, catching birds. And for them, that's okay. They know these people, and that's for them an acceptable level of risk that they're willing to take. It's an individual decision. It's not a decision that I would take, but that I don't want to be prescriptive in that way, because everyone's situation is different. And again, that's part of queering science is every individual is in their own way unique, and how you approach those situations will depend on the person, on the group that's involved, where it is, what the social and higher professional hierarchies are. I mean, and even if you are, ostensibly all, completely out, like I was at MUN, I was romantically linked to a fair number of my female grad student colleagues when I was at MUN that I, often hung around with. No, I was happily married. But so not everyone perceives, just because you think you're out doesn't necessarily mean that everyone knows that or whatever. So I think that first step is be safe, and second step is read the room and use your best judgment, because it can be a tricky one to navigate. And if you've got a potentially dicey situation, have a chat. Hopefully you can have a chat with the folks that you do know that know you're out, and say, maybe just like not keep this on the down low, but just make them aware of your concerns, because then that becomes a health and safety issue as well.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from anyone in the audience right now?
If anyone does have any questions that they don't want to ask in front of the group, you can drop me an email, a.bond@nhm.ac.uk, or find me on Twitter @thelabandfield, and I'm happy to chat with anyone either online, or we can set up a call, because I know it can be tricky for some folks.
All right. So I guess if there are no more questions, thank you very much again, Alex, for taking the time and putting in the effort to educate us all today, I guess. And yes, Alex's email is there in the chat now if anyone wants to take that down. With that, we'll say goodbye for today. And next week, just before everyone goes, I'd like to remind you all that we have seminar again, and Dr. Erin Cameron from St. Mary's University is going to be presenting. So please join us for that as well. All right, Great. See you all next week.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.